We're going to turn from global back to national now. We've got a great session coming up on the new national cyber strategy. I know you spent a lot of time kind of combing through the strategy and becoming an expert on it as well. And really the great implementation challenge. I mean, I think, we had a couple of pieces that we'd published in the Cyber Brief and at the Cyber Initiatives group about it's wonderful that we finally have this strategy. We know a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of conversations went into informing it, but how do we implement it? And I think that's what I'm most excited to hear about from this very next panel. You're welcoming Valerie Abend, who is the Senior Managing Director at Accenture. You're welcoming Kelly Rozumalski, Senior Vice President of Booz Allen Hamilton. Mark Montgomery, the former Executive Director of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and Brian Scott, who is the Deputy Assistant National Cyber Director for Cyber Policy and Programs, who had probably quite a bit to do with the rollout of this announcement. Matt, I'm going to turn over this entire panel to you.
Thank you, and it's a great panel, but I'm waiting to see some faces here, so I'll make sure we get. There we go. We've got Mark. All right, we've got everybody. Okay, so I would just like to say it's great to have this group, especially when we add the office of the cyber director, because now we have some of those that have not just ownership of the report, but the implementation strategy as well. So it's a great group we've got together here, and a group that I would say contributed a good bit to creating this. So a hat tip to the White House on their efforts to get this strategy in the hands of private sector and to really collaborate before it was released. The only real struggle we had was when it was going to be dropped, not so much that it didn't have we knew what was going to be in it. So I think that hourglass kept getting reshifted, but we adapted really well there. What I would like to do today is just, we've heard a lot about how this strategy is ambitious. And so I just wanted to kind of go around the room and just get your thoughts on what you think might be, different from strategies in the past, and where would you say the strategy really was received well by the private sector once it did drop? Valerie, let me start with you. Oh, we got you on mute, Valerie.
All right, double mute button. Now we're good, right? Okay. So listen, I think it is an ambitious strategy, but I think that's the point, right? When you're coming out from the White House, having been involved in these in the past, you don't want it to be something that like everybody's heard before. There should be real things that, while will take a lot of effort, get the world talking about what great looks like and what we need to do to move forward to make cyberspace a place where businesses and people can operate safely with digital trust. So I think it was well received because it hit on, at least from my standpoint, all the things that, from 30 years working on this that we need to be talking about, right? Like these are tangible areas, whether we're talking about software, whether we're talking about the cloud, whether we're talking about what the impact is to the everyday citizen, what the government has to do in their own procurement process, like all of these things all coming together in one place is what makes it ambitious, but also something that we need to make sure that we really focus that we focus strategically in the long term and hit some of the key wins and talk about what roadblocks will get in the way so that we all kind of work together to get those addressed, because there's a lot on the line.
All right, and Kelly?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And I think first I wanted to highlight the fact that the release of the National Cybersecurity Strategy was really a key milestone because it further solidifies cyber as a national level issue that requires a unified approach across the public and private sector and beyond. And it starts to position the nation in a posture that recognizes this notion that from an adversary's point of view, critical infrastructure sectors, industrial base, the federal government, it's all a singular target, right? And to ensure resilience against increasing threats, the U.S. must activate a whole of nation approach, and the strategy really encompasses this. And while protecting critical infrastructure and being resilient have been hallmarks of each strategy up to this point, the repeated call for accountable action from the private sector is definitely notable in this strategy. And in terms of where the strategy differs from those of the past, I definitely agree with everything Valerie said. It really calls for increased regulation of cybersecurity and critical infrastructure. It states that the regulations must be performance-based. It calls for government agencies to use their authorities to set requirements. And it states that the executive branch will really engage Congress to close gaps. It also calls for regulation on items such as cloud computing. And while this has long been a topic of discussion, the strategy is breaking new ground on the need to better manage the cybersecurity risks posed by third parties. And with this, it really proposes a strategic shift of responsibility away from end users towards companies and other parties that are in centralized positions to improve cybersecurity. And we heard a little bit about that in the last session. And just sort of two more things. The strategy calls for OMB to help accelerate technology modernization. While not necessarily a new objective by any means, the strategy could jumpstart this effort and result in the decommissioning of legacy IT systems that are not secure and expensive to maintain. And then finally, there is definitely an intentional focus on building a robust, qualified, and diverse workforce that sets the strategy apart from others and speaks volumes to the steps that we still need to take around diversity in the workplace. So I know there's more to come on the release with the release of the National Cyber Workforce and Education Strategy, but it was really good to see this need for continued focus on the diversity in the workforce.
All right, let me kick it over to you, Mark.
Thanks, and thanks for the invitation to be on this panel. So I had two thoughts. One was about workforce. I'll let that go because I agree completely with Kelly, and I just think that's, I mean, the good news is that's the one area where the NSC's kind of like rapacious attitude towards running everything runs out of steam, so they have no trouble allowing the NCD to workforce. I'm not sure what that says more about the NSC or the issue of workforce, but the issue when I look at the strategy, it really reflects Chris Inglis's core belief that I saw him on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission have, and which is only solidified in his 18 months at NCD, and that's that a strictly voluntary approach to improving our standards is not functional anymore, not with the current threat environment we're facing. So you're either going to have to incentivize, collaborate, or regulate your way to improve security, depending on the critical infrastructure you're talking about. I think there's some good opportunities coming. I think, I personally don't think that the NSC and EPA followed the guidance of the National Cyber Strategies. They stepped out the same week with a completely uncollaborated approach to water sector security that is not going to, for a lot of reasons, won't work. But principal among them is that they don't have private sector buy-in. I think that's an area where they could get a joint government industry sector setting organization that, for example, has sectors, has the EPA establish a standard, a sector type organization enforce it, and then EPA comes in and third party checks it. I give that as an example that it doesn't have to go to regulation, but I will tell you, regulation was clearly left as an option in the strategy, and that is important. And I think if I was in the cloud computing industry, I'd be worried, because I don't think we're not going to incentivize three of the richest companies in America to do anything. We're not going to, their collaboration with each other is at such a level that I doubt we could have a group collaboration with them and the government. So that leaves us with regulation. If I were them, I'd be thinking real hard about this and working it, because the last thing they want to do is have the Federal Trade Commissioner come up with a plan for regulation of the three of them. I don't think that'll go over well. So I think this strategy really lays out the truth, which is that we are leaving this kind of voluntary approach, this we know you'll do the right thing approach, because 23 years of not doing the right thing has left us extremely vulnerable.
All right, and then Brian, I'll shift it up because, being on the inside, where did you try to be ambitious with the strategy? And when you're leaning in here, did you get kind of the expectation that you were hoping for from private sector and others once it did officially get into everybody's hands?
So a few things. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to join the conversation today, and appreciate the comments made by others as we started this session. So a few things. The strategy really builds on a lot of the efforts that have been ongoing for the last few years: Executive Order 14028, National Security Memorandum 5 on improving critical infrastructure, industrial control systems. So it's building on those things. It's learning from, certainly learning from what's happened over the last few years and beyond, as well as being informed by such things as such engagements as the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and a lot of interagency and private sector engagement. One of the reasons why it's taken as long as it has to get it out is we really worked hard to try and get it right. And to do that, it does take a lot of collaboration, a lot of coordination, and getting some really expert inputs in terms of really addressing a lot of those key issues. So, as we look at it, I'll focus on one thing specifically up front. That's the regulatory piece, right? So I think we've all known for, it's been very apparent that, over the last few years that, the evolving cyber threat environment and landscape has just been, moving so fast that the voluntary, a solely voluntary only approach has just been inadequate to really secure our nation's critical infrastructure and to secure our, the nation as a whole. So, looking at that regulatory piece, what is the appropriate level of regulatory requirements that should be put out there? And we're working very hard on that. We're looking at it very closely. We are working with the Regulators Forum. It's actually titled, it's a long title. It's the Independent and Executive Branch Forum of Regulators for Cybersecurity. We're working with them. We're working with a lot of other folks in looking at how to best do that, right? So I think some of the comments were made earlier. Mark, I appreciate your comments on the water sector. I think the water sector is one of those really complex ones. It's not as easy as the regulatory requirements that FERC and NERC and DOE have relative to electricity. It's a much more complex environment. Some of these problems are very challenging. They're very difficult. I think that what the strategy has done is really laid out some very ambitious activities that we'll need to work and build out. On the regulatory piece in general, we're really looking at laying out some principles. We've had multiple conversations with the Cyber Regulators Forum, I'll call it that for short, where we've actually met with, they've had principal level meetings that they've never had before. I mean, I've been involved with that forum for about 6 years. This is the first time they've actually had principal level discussions. Chris Inglis, before he left, gave a presentation on, regulatory reciprocity to mitigate cybersecurity risk, looking at how, what are the principles that we should be looking at across the regulatory framework for cybersecurity. And, we've got a couple of quick ones that I'll mention. Chris made the statement in that meeting that, we're really looking for, only what's needed, right? So the lightest touch possible, but no lighter than what's needed. So that's a key piece. And that, as we develop these regulations, we should be looking at it the smart way, and we need to look at it the smart way. Risk informed, performance based, outcome focused, and really developed in consultation with those that are regulated. Looking at what are baseline regulatory requirements that can be harmonized across the regulatory regime, only having that select regulators need, what may be needed, their unique attributes for their sector, and then really, again, telling them those to those unique risks. So I'll stop there. I mean, I think the regulatory piece is one of the most ambitious pieces. It's going to be one of the most challenging pieces. We recognize that, but I think what's really important here is having the conversation starting and moving it forward. A lot of these things that are in the strategy have been talked about for years. Now they're on paper, they're in front of people, and we can really start having that discussion as we move towards implementation.
So I'll pitch it over to Valerie, and then we'll go back around. But it sounds like we've got a good answer on where the progress is going to go on regulatory efforts, and I'll leave that for all the rest of the panelists to touch on regulatory as it comes back around. But when we shift to the concept of liability, whenever we talk about liability for secure software and services, you usually reflect to a legislative need to get ahead of that. and pushback from those who want to limit that level of liability. In this environment, just starting with you, Valerie, do you see that we're going to get some progress on implementing something in that direction anytime soon? And leave the back door open also for you to touch on any regulatory comments you may have to follow up.
Man, I'm going to want to lean on the regulatory stuff as the former independent regulator who wrote a bunch of cyber regulations. So I think it's great that we're bringing the independent regulators to the table. It has to happen. I think there's a lot of challenges in the space of, from an independent regulatory perspective, no one is like not overseen, right? And I think about FDIC this week and some bank failures that may have happened. And their responsibility as an independent regulator, whether that be any of the federal banking regulators, or for that matter, the SEC or the CFTC or the CFPB, and let me give you as many financial regulator alphabet soup as I can give you. The reality is they are overseen and have a mission to do set in statutory authority. And when things fail because they either are not living that mission to the full extent or are strapped for resources themselves, they are pulled up in front of Congress, right? And that is a real issue for them. And 2008, when we had bank failures, we lost an agency. They literally, Congress took an agency and took it off the map, right? And so they literally folded the Office of Thrift Supervision into OCC and FDIC. So I say that because we have to respect the fact that they answer to Congress as well. And their job is to keep, in the case of the financial regulators, the entire financial system operating based on the authorities that they have. And cyber, as we know, used to say to CEOs that would come in every week from the banks, you could have a compliance-based issue for money laundering or something to that effect, face big fines, get a cease and desist, and eventually get your charter revoked and not appear as a bank anymore. But if you have a bad ATM cash out day, depending on your capital ratios, if you have an incident that impacts your ability to have integrity in the data that you have and now will get cut off from financial messaging payments systems or financial wholesale payment systems, you'll be gone in 24 to 48 hours. You won't exist as a bank anymore. Like a bad cyber attack can take you offline within a day to 2 days. So I think we have to respect the fact that there's going to have to much broader effort, not just the independent regulators, but the oversight committees about what they can and can't do. And then the other thing from a risk perspective, I would say is you really have to think about, and someone once said to me, a stack is a stack is a stack, Valerie. Why aren't you just using the NIST cybersecurity framework? And the reality is, nuclear power plants run certain stacks with certain risk processes based on that from a business perspective. Banks run certain stacks, right, that are based on certain critical business processes. They are not at the same levels of risk, and they are not looked at, and the controls around them are not the same, and how you view it and how it's not the same. And so while I respect the fact that we have to have baseline principles, the idea that the business outcomes are the same and that they'll be addressed the same, not just by the people on the ground who are the technicians, but all the way up to what I call like the big G governance, the boards and beyond, it actually isn't the same. And so I think there is an important conversation to be had here about what do we do so that the regulatory burden, if you will, is not just a burden, but it is actually fuel that brings enterprise forward. And that's what I think about when I think about the cloud discussion and regulation. I don't want to take up all the airtime. I want to be sensitive to my fellow panelists. But I do think there are models to look at from a self-regulatory organization perspective about what that could look like from a cloud perspective. I don't think we should be looking at the traditional models of what you see in some of the spaces today. I wouldn't even say NERC and FERC are the right necessarily model for that, because I think there are some serious challenges in that ability to be agile and move forward and how they do things. I think FINRA could be a better sort of starting point. And I think having that model whereby they are able to be run and governed and operating by cloud providers, by system integrators, by large scale end users of the cloud is a much better model if that's the path that we're going to go down. It just will be a lot faster. And I don't like the language of bare minimum is a trigger for me, by the way. Baseline is a trigger. As somebody who had to write like baseline, I'm like, baseline was guidance from like 2000 and actually not even 2001. It was like maybe even in the 90s. You're talking about really outdated perspective on risk. And if we go to the bare minimum, we go to the baseline, you're actually not incentivizing the safe space that we need to drive for digital trust. What we want to have is to say that if we follow this process, how do we actually act as a fuel? How is cyber fueling the future of investment into these capabilities, business investment into going into these better places? And I think that's an approach I'd like us to see. I know I didn't touch on your liability, but I've talked for a while, so I'll pause there.
Well, let me throw it over to Kelly. Kelly, so with regards to either the liability side or the regulation, do you have some foot stomping there to do?
Yeah, and I'll go quick. I know I only have a few minutes, but from a regulatory standpoint, I mean, just this week alone, right, we heard the administration explain that they're not planning to necessarily fix all the differences between conflicting regulators, right? But instead, they're looking at implementing a process for reciprocity or another forum where companies can potentially meet multiple requirements without having to go through multiple assessments. So this means that we could get to a state of, if it's good enough for one regulator, it's good enough for another. So I think there's definitely more to come there. And I think Valerie hit on a lot of the regulation pieces. From a liability standpoint, the strategy definitely calls for companies to be held liable for security flaws in their products and services, and Mark hit on this. And for an organization, securing what you sell now becomes not just an objective, but a defensive measure to protect their business. So one thing that I think will be really key is defining new legislation to address these requirements, really determining how they are going to be measured, and also really determining what happens when software developers don't meet these requirements. Over the past, 2+ years, the federal government has experienced the effects of software weaknesses and the costs inherited by them, right? But the larger public and private collaborative efforts mentioned throughout this strategy will be critical to the success of securing software and services moving forward. So more coordinated vulnerability disclosure across sectors, a process for mitigating risks presented by unsupported software, and of course, SBOM, software bill of materials. We're all continuing to hear a lot about this. I think it's going to be really important to monitor the success of these initiatives, but the fact that they were called out so repeatedly in the strategy, I think was very good.
All right, thank you. And just a heads up for Mark and Brian, I did negotiate an extra 5 minutes for us on the end, so we're not going to cut you off. So let's turn over to Mark, and then we'll let Brian have last comments.
So that's 6 minutes for me, 1 minute for Brian. I think he's happy with that. All right. So real quick, what I'll say is on liability, this is like a diving competition. There's a degree of difficulty thing. And in this whole strategy, it's a great strategy. But when it says the federal government will do X about the federal government, well, that degree of difficulty is like 1.0, it's easy. But when it says the strategy says the federal government will do this to the private sector, the degree of difficulty raises to like 4.0 as you try to get legislation passed. It gets to be a much harder event to execute. And look, we had the liability protection language in the commission. It isn't the first thing to get killed every legislative cycle, but it is the second thing, right? The first thing is like Congress, reorganize yourself. Congress kills that idea really quickly. But then the next thing they do is say, hey, this liability protection is not going there. So I'm excited to watch the administration work this issue. I think they have a good argument. I agree with them. I just think it's a tough sell up on Capitol Hill. We'll see. It's really going to take like an egregious event that really puts a lot of the population's, safety or quality of life at risk. And then you'll see Congress come around quickly on the liability protections. One other thing on regulation, I agree with Valerie. It's not going to be one size fits all, and it's not all going to be a strict regulatory agency model. I think, as I said earlier, it's going to come down. There's some great opportunities here for industry and government to get together, set standards that are good for both. And the beauty of ransomware is it's made industry want this more than just telling them there's a nation state threat that in a crisis will have wished that they'd done better. The ransomware is you personally wish you'd done better after you had to make that payment or pay your cyber insurance bill or whatever it is. So I think in regulatory case, I see room for headway. In the liability case, I think there's going to be some headwinds with the Congress.
All right, Brian, last words.
So real quick, I appreciate Valerie's comments directly. I don't like the term baseline either. We don't want to set a floor. What we really want to do is to inspire excellence, right? But there's got to be some sort of minimum threshold that we want everybody to meet how do we bridge that is something that I think we'll need to continue working on. The point that I would note, and I agree completely that one size doesn't fit all. It is not, the attributes of the different sectors are, obviously very different. The controls that are needed are different, but there are some things that are common. And to those that we can at least have that discussion on and come to some agreement on, I think will be very helpful. And again, I think just getting the conversation going, we recognize that independent regulators have their independent authorities, but to at least have the conversation with everybody in the same room, I think is extremely valuable. And I do think that the regulators are at least being informed by what is going on across the spectrum. So again, this is the start of a conversation. We're not flipping a switch here and being able to get anything magically done relative to regulatory requirements. But I think without having a conversation, we're in a much worse place. So I think we're moving along well with that. The liability issue, again, shifting the liability and putting the liability where it belongs is another challenge as we move forward. But I think these the items that are in the strategy that relate to this, looking at those two key shifts, and I listened a little bit earlier to the conversation with Jeanette and others, this rebalancing of the responsibility for the defense of cybersecurity and making, looking at the roles and the responsibilities, that's a key piece. And then the other piece is really this realigning of investment towards the future, right? So that we're not just, we're always going to be playing defense in terms of addressing issues that occur when they occur, but we really need to be looking forward to meet the future challenges and to address those and resource those. So I'll stop there. I appreciate everyone's comments, and I think they're very informative, and I think the discussion, again, is just very helpful as we move forward. So thanks.
And thanks to the whole panel. And just know, Brian, you've got a lot of willing helpers when it comes time for any feedback you may want on that implementation plan. So we've got a lot of good thoughts and happy to share.
Excellent. So my thanks as well, Matt. Fantastic job moderating that session. Brian, thank you so much for just your engagement on this. I think we were stacked a little heavier on the industry side for this session than we were on the government side, but that was a fantastic conversation. Once again, I just want to remind people, Valerie Abend is the Senior Managing Director at Accenture. Kelly Rozumalski, who you heard from there, is the Senior Vice President at Booz Allen Hamilton. Mark Montgomery, we all know, is one of our SIG principals, also the former Executive Director of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. And Brian Scott, of course, is Deputy Assistant National Cyber Director for Cyber Policy and Programs. Matt, that was a great job. What kind of stuck out for you there?
Well, it's that we see that harmonizing word is a tough one when it comes to regulatory. So the good news is that there's going to be some sliding around of recognition, and that reciprocity is going to be key.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
The Cypher Brief, because national security is everyone's business.